Hello and welcome to Tigers by the Fire, a podcast out of Holy Cross High School about World War II discussions and stories. This is Season 5, Episode 2, and it's going to be on the Battle of Anzio. With me today are Joey Timpany.
Hey.
Grace and Jenny.
Hello, my name is Grace and Jenny.
And Jacob Guichard.
Hello, I'm Jacob Guichard.
And today's podcast, as I said, is going to be about the Anzio invasions. This is in the Italian campaign in 1943 and then early 1944. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joey to give some background information.
All right, here we go. So just looking at the state of the war as we're going into early 1943, which our story's kind of going to start at, we have the Allied offensive that had begun in Italy in earlier this year, I believe, with Operation Husky, as they invaded through Sicily and got to mainland Italy. They'd gotten to a point after some rather rough landings at Salerno in southern Italy near Naples. Things had gotten pretty dire, and so the Allies had begun to stalemate further up near the area of Monte Cassino, which would along the German Gustav line, very, very strong defense line along the Apennine Mountains. That this had been a complete stalemate for a number of months, and while the Allies are struggling down here in Italy, the Soviets are gaining a lot of traction up north, which increases the pressure on the Allies to kind of get some more feet moving on the ground, get further up into Italy to where they need to be at. And so there's a lot of pressure on the Allies at this point, which leads to some kind of idea they need to get around the Gustav line itself. And so originally, this was a U.S. idea, organized by General Eisenhower himself, and as well with a British general named Harold Alexander, who's going to be very prevalent throughout this story. And the base idea was to land somewhere behind that German defensive line and do anything they could to try and break that vicious stalemate they'd been stuck in. And so originally they'd planned to meet and discuss this idea in December of 1943, December 20th, but it was initially scrapped due to American logistical concerns over planning the whole thing, because it was a matter of importance at that point. So there was a lot of apprehension over it. But the plan was still created, however, as it was picked up by the British command, especially Winston Churchill, who kind of eventually championed this campaign and he almost sponsored it in a way that it was his kind of like brainchild, what he wanted to do. And so the plan was to land by near the fishing/resort towns of Anzio and Nettuno, which are just 35 miles south of Rome and 80 miles north of the Gustav line. This is far behind enemy lines. So the idea was, because those were pretty already well-made ports there, it'd be a good idea to land there. They could supply themselves easily and get going. And so the original kind of apprehension that had been going on was kind of alleviated as the British took control of this, and it became a joint command operation as well during this time, which kind of probably helped the actual invasion later on, was the reorganization of command within the Mediterranean, because things had gotten kind of iffy as the war went on, and so the command structure was a bit reorganized, putting the British in command, I believe, with the air, and General Alexander would be the one kind of presiding over this exact operation of Anzio.
Yeah, and so to what Joey's kind of talking about is, the Allied command changes mid-1943, right? They invade Sicily, they take it over, and Eisenhower and the Allied command chief, they're going to be refocusing on eventually D-Day in France. And so this operation is going to go more closely under British control. Like, as you said, the air support is going to be largely British air support, which is coming in from the Mediterranean, which is their kind of holdings already. And so I'm glad you brought that up. And then also the Churchill part, which is kind of interesting, because it is kind of his baby. This is where he thought the invasion should take place. He was definitely afraid of an invasion of France, and he called it the soft underbelly. But as you guys, I'm sure, are going to tell us, this is not really nothing soft about the Battle of Anzio.
Absolutely not. This gets really, really bad as time goes on. It gets even almost World War I like as time goes on. It's terrible. We're going to get into that. But just quickly, we're going to take a step back and look at besides just Harold Alexander, who's in command of the operation as a Brit, is going to be the people who were in command of this operation as a whole. The U.S. general who was put in charge of figuring this out along with Alexander was General Mark Clark, who is quite a character that we're going to get into close towards the end, but he's very prevalent in the planning of this operation. And so the U.S. Sixth Corps was chosen to lead the invasion, commanded by Major General John Lucas, who was a veteran, a very highly respected man at this point for his service in World War I and a number of other command posts. And he'd recently been reassigned to Sixth Corps. But as we're kind of as you're going to see, as we approach Anzio, Lucas's health and ability to command are kind of getting a little iffy. And so he's a name to keep an eye on because a lot of the trouble with Anzio is kind of centered around him in a way. Not just him, but he's part of it. And we're approaching right now the kind of issues that the issues that are already going to plague Anzio before they even landed at the beaches was planning. As Clark's original instruction to Lucas were a little bit vague, as Clark and Harold never really came to Harold, my best friend. Clark and Alexander never came to a full agreement on what the goal of the actual operation was. And so Lucas had instructed him to, let me find it right here. Basically, that their main goal was to kind of draw forces away from the Gustav line in not to do a whole lot, but as long as to draw forces away from the Gustav line in order for a breakout. And neither Lucas nor Clark had a whole lot of confidence in this operation itself. And I believe it was Lucas remarked in a bit of something that plagued Winston Churchill, who's, he loves this operation a lot, stating that the whole affair has a strong odor of Gallipoli, which was Churchill's horribly failed naval invasion of the Dardanelles during the First World War. So it was a bit of a nip at him. But to look at the actual difference between the two command perspectives, the British had the idea, or the main thought, which they had envisioned, was to land in Anzio, then immediately try to break forward into what is called the Alban Hills region, it's further into Italy, and take vital German supply routes, German communications, cut them off, and capture and hold the Alban Hills to control the two highways next to the area, which are Route 7 and Route 6, to basically cut off any kind of German retreat or easy retreat from the Gustav line. And like I'd mentioned before, the American perspective was quite different, was a more stagnant kind of draw the Germans away idea. And so that's kind of where the issues begin with the invasion. And on top of this, the rehearsal that they had for the invasion on January 19th, which is, I believe 3 days before the invasion itself, went terribly. And so this is already not giving confidence to the men there. Now I'm going to hand it off to Jacob for a little bit of stuff about Anzio itself before we get into the actual invasion.
So yeah, before we talk about the battle itself, we have a couple of fun facts or just interesting facts to just get us in the mood to talk about Anzio. So both Roman emperors, Nero and Caligula, were born in ancient Anzio, or Antium as it was called. The base of Anzio's main port was built by Nero, and he also constructed a personal theater there. It was in Anzio that Cicero rebuilt his collections from his libraries after his exile was over as a secretive storage area. Giuseppe Garibaldi's son, and Menotti Garibaldi, is buried just outside Anzio. Both he and his father were vital in the wars for Italian unification in the mid-1800s. And then back to Joey.
All right, I'm taking it off for a little bit, and then we're going to hand it off to Grayson. But now we're looking at the actual first few days of the invasion. So January 22nd, 1944, of course, at 0200 hours, the Allied forces landed in the Anzio and Nettuno areas on the beaches with a combined force of about 3,600 men and 3,200 vehicles. This was a somewhat sizable force they were put on the ground. And their landings were preceded, however, by, which I find this interesting because I feel like you don't really hear about this, a bunch of converted British landing craft. And they converted to basically kind of fire rocket barrages. And they'd fire, I think, an estimated amount of about 800 5-inch rockets to soften up that beachhead. And so after that initial barrage, the forces were, of course, landed. The U.S. 3rd Infantry at X-Ray Beach, which was 6 miles east of Nettuno, so kind of on that southern side. And then the British 1st Infantry landed at Peter Beach, which was about 6 miles north of Anzio, closer to Rome. And the landings themselves were met with almost no resistance, as those very small German presence in the city itself, it had been mostly abandoned, and so there wasn't a larger civilian populace. And so this was so totally different than what the Allies had expected, considering the horrible events at Salerno a few months prior. And so they were able to advance a few miles inland and establish themselves a beachhead. The U.S. 6,615th Ranger Force captured Anzio itself, the city, and then the U.S. 509th Parachute captured Nettuno. And the initial invasion, of course, seemed a huge success on that day, and a lot of people during the time when they realized how good the invasion had gone initially were excited about it because it seemed like everything had gone well despite all the concern about it. And this seemed like the kind of nail in the coffin for Italy. And as they landed, Lucas, remember John Lucas, who is the commander or the general in charge of this operation, made the choice to take the American option, as he's an American general, takes the option to dig in at Anzio and wait for reinforcements to kind of build up a stronger force there, instead of making any kind of idea to break out or swiftly make an escape from the beachhead itself. Now I'm going to hand off to Grayson for some information.
Thank you, Joey. Now we're going to discuss the German elite and the armor behind them. We have General Eberhard von Mackensen, the German general put in charge of containing Allied forces at Anzio, the 14th Army. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring is presiding over Axis forces as a whole within Italy. He would react to the landings about an hour after they began at 0300 hours and draw troops from across Europe to contain Anzio. Two notable divisions that would partake in the containment were the German Hermann Göring Tank Division, who were formerly an elite tank unit that had been operating as a sub-military entity similar to the SS, but for Hermann Göring. By this point, the division had been through a lot of fighting and barely escaped Sicily intact, being left in a crippled state entering Anzio. Next was the 301st Panzer Division, who was making use of German Wunderwaffe, or wonder weapon, known as the Goliath, which had been a remote-controlled anti-tank weapon that could be remotely detonated to destroy armored vehicles. Kesselring also ordered Vertinghoff, the general in command over the Gustav Line, to cancel a counterattack in response to an Allied attack over the Garlingo River, just a day before Operation Single commenced.
Yeah, and so I think on top of that, Kesselring, who a lot of people don't necessarily know about, is one of the best generals of the entire war for the Germans. He defends Italy really 43 all the way through 1945. And so when the war ends, that's when he effectively gives up Italy in the north. And I'm glad, Grayson, that you brought up the Hermann Göring division. They're absolutely obliterated in Sicily. And so by the time they get here, they're not necessarily what they would be. And the other thing I think that's important to recognize too about Italy is the German army was built really to fight in these like rolling hills and plains in Central Europe. And Italy doesn't have that. And so there's a lot of adaptation that comes along here, like with some of the wonder weapons. I think Jacob's gonna go next.
Yeah. So as like German forces began to like come into Anzio and start like actual fighting begins, I wanted to bring up Ernie Pyle, who was like a popular writer who documented the experiences of soldiers during World War II. And he was in both the European and Pacific fronts. So here's the quote. "When you get to Anzio, you waste no time getting off the boat, for you have been feeling pretty much like a clay pigeon in a shooting gallery. But after a few hours in Anzio, you wish you were back on the boat, for you could hardly describe being ashore as any haven of peacefulness." So as you can imagine how, like what the quote is kind of trying to get at is how many of these soldiers were like anxious and like eager to get off this boat because of the conditions they had on it. But then after they left the beach and had to go into battle, they realized how terrible the conditions they lived in. And we'll talk more about the conditions as we go on.
Yeah.
Going back to Joey.
All right. Thank you, Jacob, for that. Ernie Pyle is going to be pretty prevalent throughout here. He documents a whole lot about it. And so back to the command, we have General Lucas again. Despite that, the Germans coming in, he certainly wasn't idle and just twiddling his thumbs, as he, of course, had been waiting for reinforcements. And so the Allied forces at this point were 36 at the point of landing, but at this point had increased to about 70,000 troops, 237 tanks, and 508 heavy guns, aka artillery. They're going to be really important later on, and about 27,000 tons of supplies. This would put Lucas in a very advantageous position if he were to make any sort of offensive, as the numbers difference at this point is about 70,000 for the Allied troops and 40,000 about for the Germans. So he's in quite a big numerical advantage there if he were to make any kind of offensive move. But he chooses not to. He chooses to stay his hand and continue to build up forces. And so while he's doing this, there was a small German probing, a small counterattack launched on the 28th of January, but it hadn't done much. And this choice to stay made virtually everybody but Lucas upset. Mark Clark was upset. Harold Alexander was upset. Churchill was furious. Churchill begins to petition General Alexander to get Lucas to do something over and over and over again throughout this entire campaign. But especially Mark Clark, because this is, Lucas under his command. He visited many times, but one of the notable visits of General Clark was he took a PT boat, a small torpedo boat, reconnaissance, or, attacking larger ships, from the city of Naples, which is in southern Italy to Anzio itself, nearly dying due to a friendly fire on the way there. They were mistaken for a German or an Italian torpedo boat and fired on by a Allied ship, nearly killing Mark Clark for this one little expedition. But I'm going to give it back to Jacob for another quote from Ernie Pyle.
So yeah, back to Ernie Pyle, like in his descriptions of Anzio. One of them is being, a man was just as liable to get hit by German artillery, standing in the doorway of his villa where he slept at night as he was in a command post 5 miles out in the field. And another quote going along with that one saying, the Germans shot shells of half a dozen sizes, each of which makes a different sound of explosion. You can't gauge distance at all. One shell may land within your block and sound not much louder than a shotgun. Another landing a quarter mile away makes the earth tremble as in an earthquake and starts your heart pounding. So again, like these quotes from his documentation shows how like unexpected like living on the beachhead was, and not knowing if you were going to get bombarded by German artillery one day or just be perfectly fine the next day. And I'm going to pass it back to Joey.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Jacob. And so continuing, we have Lucas's first major offensive breakout from Italy, or attempted breakout. That was on January 30th, about 8 days after the landing. Breakout's ordered, aiming specifically at 2 cities, which you're going to hear a lot of in the next couple minutes, Cisterna and Campoleone. Campoleone's a major rail hub within southern Italy, and Cisterna is placed right on the highway Route 7, which you mentioned earlier, one of the main goals to capture at this point. And so the first strikeout, which is to Campoleone, I believe, on the west, was mainly British force, but supports from the elements of the U.S. 1st Armored, as well as the 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions, who struck out towards Campoleone. This would get very ugly very quickly, as there's a handful of major factors that would contribute to this. First of all, the British forces designated at the U.S. 1st Armored, which is, of course, tanks, to not use the highway towards Campoleone, as it was designated as a British zone or within their area of operation. This doesn't seem that insane if you were talking about maybe in the plains of northern Europe, but when we're looking down here in Italy, these areas are wet and marshy, and it's winter, so it's cold, and it's basically everything is mud. And so the British had referred to these areas of mud as wadis, which I think was it's a Middle Eastern term that they picked up. And so that obviously did not go very well, as the necessary armor could not follow up with the infantry required, and they got in the infantry ahead, who were without their armored support, were nearly overrun by the 3rd Panzer Division. And then further east, Cisterna, things had gone no better, as the 767 members, as I'd mentioned earlier, some of the 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions, who were, there's elements of them both within Cisterna and Campoleone, they had attempted to infiltrate Cisterna, proceeding the attack to kind of weaken their defense to just see what's going on. And of those 767 men, only 6 would make it back to friendly lines, the rest being either killed or captured. And this devastating loss, once received by their captain, the man presiding over them, William O'Darby, although he was not present at the fighting, he heard this news, and it was reported that he began to simply weep for the loss of his men. And this small example, along with Jacob's quotes from earlier, were the demonstrations of the absolute horror of Anzio itself. And this gets even worse, as well. We transfer over to General Lucian Truscott, who's the general in charge of the 3rd Infantry Division. We're going to remember his name because he pops up a lot and he's going to be important later. They had begun to hold some ground, however, but once they had gained that ground, a desperate fight broke out between the 2 armored divisions, mostly containing the U.S. Armored, and the German Hermann-Göring Panzer Division. Thankfully, the weakened, as Mr. Vides had mentioned, very weakened division at this point, as well as the 26th Panzer, against that 4th Ranger Battalion and elements of the U.S. 1st Armored. And along with this fighting by the troops themselves, there was incessant artillery fire constantly throughout this entire battle, which kind of sets up the scene for a lot of the battles at Anzio, which were dominated by the use of artillery. And so this would go on for about 2 days with no real, back and forth between the 2 sides. Not a whole lot of ground gained or lost. It was stalemate fighting. And so at this point, within the battle, which had been, I believe it's only eight or 9 days after the initial landing itself, about 6,500 Allied casualties would take place in just 11 days. There we go. And this seemed like the worst case scenario that it could have been, as everything had been going pretty bad. But luckily, as almost a complete stroke of complete luck, the day that Lucas had decided to attack at Anzio was immediately interrupted a planned German counterattack, saving countless lives from the encirclement that the Germans were about to take upon the Allied forces. So it was a very lucky, very good stroke of luck for the Allies at this point. And Lucas, again, although this had been a good thing on looking back at it during the time, that was the failed breakout was not well received by the Allied command. And this time visiting him was General Harold Alexander, as we mentioned before. And during that meeting, which obviously didn't go well, Lucas described the interaction as that he was kind enough, but I'm afraid is not pleased. My head will probably fall in the basket, but I've done my best. So he was not totally ignorant of his own failure at Anzio, although he was in fact put in a very tough position to hold and defend, as well as to break out from. So transitioning a little bit, we're going into basically from winter into spring. We're talking about the early February campaigns within Anzio. So after the string of offensive actions by the Allies in late January, early February, the lines had become stagnant, like I'd said previously, and both sides were kind of exhausted at this point. But the Germans had taken advantage of this and began a counterattack to attempt to try and finally dislodge the Allies from that beachhead. And they ended up breaking through a small portion through the Allied lines. But the Allied would end up defending this attack by using their greatest strength, as we're going to see, which would be the main difference to break out of Anzio itself, which would be the use of artillery. And so for the next 3 days straight, during this skirmish, each side would bombard the other almost constantly for this 3-day period. So I'm going to transfer off to Jacob.
Thank you. As the conditions in Anzio proceeded to worsen, men of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division detailed their experiences. Tarzan Williams describes how they couldn't even dig trenches or foxholes as the water line was so high that when they were digging, they had to, quote, bail them out with just our helmets. John P. Griffin, a Jeep driver with 3rd Battalion HQ, explains how the constant artillery fire even took out his own Jeep. He details as early as, quote, the first night in Anzio, I lost my Jeep. Woke up the next morning. A shell had come in during the night and just made a sieve out of it. It was a total wreck. And yeah, these quotes just go back to the quotes from earlier from Ernie Pyle about the constant artillery from both sides and just how rough it was and terrible it was to experience this. And I'll pass it on to Grayson.
Thank you, Jacob. Transitioning to the German side of the struggle, the Germans weren't having a much better time than the Allied forces, as von Mackensen and Kesselring were beginning to struggle while the campaign continued. In suspicion of an Allied invasion at Civitavecchia, Kesselring diverted troops about 60 miles north just in case. This possible landing was given credibility by German sightings of an enemy air reconnaissance unit, which always has only been encountered where invasions occur. The situation at Cassino began to worsen for the German forces, twisting Kesselring's hand, requiring him to reorganize and divert a machine gun battalion and an artillery company down south. Kesselring still needed to reinforce Anzio as much as he could. He still feared the small breachhead, leading him to transferring the 76th Panzer Division from von Wintinghoff to Mackensen at Anzio. Even von Mackensen knew that the enemy's strength is based in his accurate and strong artillery, which is abundantly supplied with ammunition.
And that's one of the things, and you guys are kind of in the infancy of talking about the war. One of the things that you'll discover is that when the sides get into stalemates, it ends up just being artillery barrages. I mean, there's other things that happen, obviously, but when we talk about the Battle of the Bulge, it's artillery. When we talk about the breakout of Normandy, it's going to be these huge artillery fights. And so you see that here at Anzio in a fairly large scale. And then you see Mackensen bringing up the enemies have resupplies. They continuously have more and more stuff. And that tends to be what ultimately is going to break the Germans at the end of the day. Joey?
And so we're going to continue on with looking back at the operations. And so here, like Grayson had just discussed, there's a similarity. I think I found a similarity between Mackinson and Kesselring's decision on a February offensive and the kind of lackluster execution of it. Is that Kesselring doesn't wholly believe in Mackinson. He thinks he's far too pessimistic and cautious of a commander. On the other side, Mackinson believes that Kesselring's too optimistic. He doesn't understand the desperate condition of his troops at that time. And in a similar issue here, you see that those same problems are found within the Allied command, like the pessimism of Lucas and Clark over the actual feasibility of the operation, and the Alexander and Churchill's, inherent optimism and joy over the actual completion of the operation. And so from there, we're going to move on to the mid-February campaigns, which it's still been going. As the German offenses, although devastating, had been weathered, and the line held at Anzio. And the fiercest fighting had been done near Campoleone, in and around the towns of Aprilia and Caraceto. And Aprilia is pretty important. That's one spot that the Germans are going to try to take a number of times. And it's given the name The Factory, or dubbed the name The Factory, as it's one of Mussolini's, I believe they're called model fascist towns that he tried to implement across Italy, were little kind of areas of what a town should be like, And so it very kind of cookie cutter structure of a town. So that's what they'd call it, The Factory. Despite those heavy losses, the Allied support was strong. As reported, the 157th Infantry Regiment, a part of the 45th Infantry Division, as Jacob mentioned earlier, their artillery support had fired an estimated 24,000 rounds of ammunition during just the 2-day-long slog. And this little snippet of the conditions at Anzio only got worse, especially with the upcoming Operation Fish Fang, which was the German counterattack on the Allied forces at Anzio. This would be the largest push made by the Germans so far. And so it would launch on February 16th to a devastating effect. And so on this same day that Operation Fish Fang kicked off, General Alexander had placed Lucian Truscott and Vivian Evola, who were both, I believe they're at Anzio at the time, and they're under General Lucas, but they're kind of elevated to a bit more of a overview of the operation itself to kind of start pushing Lucas out of his command post. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to pass off about Operation Fish Fang itself to Grayson.
Thank you, Joey. And as he was starting off, this push was supported by virtually every artillery battery that the Germans had at their disposal, including two 283 millimeter Krupp K5 railway cannons. These railway cannons were horrifying guns. Were given apt nicknames by the Allies, Anzio Annie and Anzio Express. The mental and physical effect of these artillery cannons they had on the troops were horrifying, as they could strike almost anywhere at Anzio, with the German mountain observation posts giving them clear lines of sight. As German forces struck again towards Aprilia, taking the long fought over factory, as it was called, but also to split Allied forces in two. Passing it on to Joey.
Yeah, and these initial breakouts, these initial punches by the German forces were eventually cut short, as the one concern, as Grayson had mentioned about Mackinson understanding the weight of Allied artillery, would be the downfall of Operation Fish Fang. As at this point, when the Germans had come far enough inland that Allied naval ships had begun bombarding German positions as they were pushed closer to the beach, that not only are the Allied guns that are on the shore already bombarding the German positions, but the nearby ships that the Allies could spare were bombarding Germans. And so as the situation continues to worsen, I'm going to hand it back to Grayson for a very important person.
All right. Thank you, Joey. One Allied soldier has one of the most telling and heartfelt experiences at Anzio and throughout the war, a man named Audie Murphy. And here is his poem titled, "The Crosses Grow on Anzio." "O gather round me, comrades, and listen while I speak of a war, a war, a war, where hell is 6 feet deep. Along the shore, the cannons roar. Oh, how can a soldier sleep? The going's slow on Anzio, and the hell is 6 feet deep. Praise be to God for this captured sod, that rich with blood does seep. With yours and mine, like butchered swines, and hell is 6 feet deep. The death awaits, there is no debate, no triumph will we reap? The crosses grow on Anzio, where hell is 6 feet deep. Murphy would go on to be one of the most decorated U.S. Army soldiers in history, receiving every possible award from the U.S. Army at the time, including some awards from France and Belgium. He would pursue acting following the war, having an immensely successful career. Passing it back on to Joey.
Thank you, Grayson. And now getting back into Anzio itself, as of the 20th of February, which is about 4 days after Fishfangin started, it had halted as a whole, and it ultimately had failed to dislodge the Allied beachhead. So 2 days later, on February 22nd, General Clark would finally replace General Lucas entirely, placing Lucian Truscott, who was the man that I mentioned earlier, who was heading the 3rd Infantry Division and then elevated to being right under Lucas himself, had now been put in Allied command of all the forces at Anzio. And so after this final push by the Germans, everything would kind of fall quiet. There was a small push by the Germans on February 29th, but at this point, Germans, like I mentioned earlier, supplies had dwindled by a lot, and both sides, but more so the Germans, had been completely exhausted. And so after that lackluster offensive on the 29th, everything would seem to go in the Allies' favor for the rest of the battle. And so here is the beginning of the end of the road to Rome. On May 5th, after 2 months of stagnant holding, this is 2 months after, we gone from February into May, so it was a lot of stalemate fighting. General Alexander ordered a new offensive plan known as Operation Buffalo, which was intended to strike Cisterna, thus leaving the Alban Hills, which was the British, I want to emphasize this, the British idea of the operation was to capture the Alban Hills. And so this, of course, was in his mind, the intent of the whole invasion, as previously mentioned, to capture the Alban Hills and cut off any German supply, communication, and easy retreat from the Gustav line. I'm going to pass it over to Jacob.
General Max Clark had other ideas, however, sparking up the difference in communication that had caused the whole debacle of the operation, as he then ordered for the modification of the plan to strike mostly at Rome itself. This was an odd decision, as Rome offered no real strategic importance at this exact moment, but made sense when looking at General Max Clark's character. Clark had served in World War I and was a West Point graduate, so he was no stranger to command. By the time Allied forces began the Italian campaign, he was the youngest 3-star general in the U.S. Army. He was close friends with Eisenhower, despite being 6 years younger, and had participated in planning Operation Torch. Clark did have an ego, however, and this was noted even by General George S. Patton. Let that sink in. Who described the interactions with Clark as so: "I think that if you treat a skunk nicely, he will not piss on you as often." This young arrogance is what led him to choosing the, quote, glorious route and taking Rome instead of using the bulk of his force to punch through to the Alban Hills and possibly cutting off the majority of German forces in Italy. I'll pass it back to Joey.
Thank you, Jacob. That's a little insight onto General Clark, who kind of botches the whole thing by going towards Rome, leaving, I think, only one division to capture the Alban Hills itself. And things would continue to go good for the Allies, however. As of May 11th, the Gustav line collapsed with the further south, which is kind of the whole point of the operation, with the success of Operation Diadem to break through the Gustav line finally. And so the Allied advance began from the south, further compromising any kind of German resistance as they began to swell up from further south. And Operation Buffalo itself, as previously mentioned, had launched on May 23rd, originally through Cisterna, as it was supposed to, but like we'd said earlier, General Clark decided to swivel most of his forces towards Rome, barreling through the beleaguered German forces as they had to kind of retreat further and further back. But, however, on orders from Adolf Hitler, back to the German perspective, Kesselring, on orders from Hitler, abandoned Rome itself on June 2nd, allowing Allied forces, along with Mark Clark right behind, to capture Rome itself on June 4th, completely unopposed. This would mark, with the capture of Rome, the definitive end of the Battle of Anzio.
Yeah, and the thing about it is the Allies don't think this is ever going to take this long. If Anzio works, it's supposed to happen in a couple of weeks. And I'm glad you guys brought up Mark Clark taking Rome, because he does. He diverts a lot of forces to that, and then he captured it on June 4th, and he gets mad because it's only going to be in American newspapers for a day, because on June 6th, 1944, D-Day happens. And after that, that is the primary story coming out of Europe. And so he's actually furious that the Allies didn't delay D-Day to let Rome be more of an event. But Very good job, guys. We only have a couple minutes left before we have to go. But I guess before I let you guys go, so whose idea was it to do Anzio?
It was mine.
Okay. So did you have any idea about it before you did research, or was it just something you had heard about?
Well, so actually the kind of story where I got it from is it's a little weird, but like there was a band that I like. I'm sure you can already see where this is going. Yeah. And one of their songs had like an excerpt from Audie Murphy's thing. And so I'd heard it and I was interested in it. So I looked it up. I looked up Audie Murphy and I looked up where the poem actually came from. And it was Battle of Anzio. And so I had never heard anything about it before. And so like I still say pretty ignorant of what the actual invasion was until now. And I decided this would be an interesting, like, because this could have changed a lot about the war. I believe it could have changed a lot if he didn't make that split point decision to go to Rome instead of basically capping off most of, a lot of the German resistance within Italy still left.
Yeah. And then, so you guys were just kind of along for the ride and just started researching with him. And to your point, if Anzio fails, it's very hard for D-Day to happen. But very good job, guys. And this was Tigers by the Fire. Thank you for listening.